to you what you gave. None of this is ours. We're tenants. The idea is, and we'll see this here in a moment, he's like, we're tenants. When Joseph he collected 5% and then he sold that grain back to the people. First he collected all the money. Then he collected all the animals. Then he collected all the people in the land. Everything belonged to Pharaoh. Pharaoh was the king. He owned all the property. And then they distributed the property back to the people and said, give me 20% and the rest is for you and your family. The Pharaoh owned the land and the people were tenants on the land, but they were only on it at his pleasure. And really that's the concept of what God was to Israel. He's the God king. He owned all the land, and they were only on the land, and it was distributed to them at his pleasure, and they owed him a portion back. And he said 20%, 10% to the Levites and 10% for other things. So you kind of see this kind of similarity here, and that's what David is acknowledging. It's all yours. We're just tenants on it. You gave it to us. If we give anything back to you, it's humbling for us to do because it's just the abundance you've handed to us. But as you look at Jacob, that's really, he was a sojourner. The psalmist claimed, I'm a sojourner. David says we're all sojourners because we don't stand on this earth. We stand on the promises of God. And really that's what we're going to see in a lot of this closing chapter is we see men who are faithful, who hold to the promises of God, who place their hope in the promises of God and see the harm and the roughness of this world and look forward to something better. And really I just think this chapter 47 is really a lot about that concept. So I just find that a fascinating aspect to this chapter. Another thing I wanted to just look at for a moment, even though we briefly alluded to it, in 47, starting in verse 20 through 26, here's where it talks about Joseph what Joseph did, selling the grain back to the people. But the end result was 20% of the produce of all the land of Egypt went back to Pharaoh. How did that happen? How did that come about? Through Joseph, by the hand of God. God gave a vision to Pharaoh, and Joseph interpreted that vision, understood it, and made a plan to preserve the people. Through the course of that plan, Joseph acquired everything in Egypt and then set up a central government and a taxation for the people to live on the land and to be tenant farmers of Pharaoh. Joseph was looking after the well-being of the people in this because if all the land belonged to Pharaoh he got 20%, well then there was a national interest in increasing the produce of the land. They would have had reserves of grain for famine, just as Joseph had already provided. They would have had maybe some extra money to build irrigation systems to help make improvements on the land, make the farms more productive outside of the Nile River Delta, which the Egyptians actually took time and did. So you see that all this is set up, this national interest, this central government concept, and it was all done by God. And it's an interesting thing that this is kind of the way humans would be governed from this point forward is through a central control kind of a governmental system. And there was a 20% produce. So the question I have is how much do you pay in taxes? Probably around 20%. It's just one of those things. But one concept is what is that? In Egypt, the 20% was a result of a form of slavery. They were all slaves to Pharaoh. He put them on the land and let them pay taxes. So it just gives a concept there as far as you are working for the government when you pay taxes. However, it's a government that God set up. In Romans chapter 13, Paul comments about this. It says, so we'll read a couple verses. Romans 13, 1 through 7, but we'll read 1, 2, 4, and 6. Verse 1, it says, "Every person is to be subject to the government authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they will have opposed those who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves." So there it just talks about governments are established and given authority by God. That's exactly what we see happening in Egypt. You can kind of understand how God went about doing that, and you can look through history and see that in many different ways. In Acts 27, I think, Acts 17, Paul says that God defined the borders, He put the people in it at the proper time. So you see God doing all this work for nations and establishing nations and rule and authority. Verse 4, this is talking about the government. "For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing, but it is a minister of a God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil." So here you see another element is the government is intended by God to do good. Now, on Sunday we were talking about government persecution of Christians, so it doesn't always do good. But we also see an example here in the text of Genesis. What happens to Egypt when it starts oppressing God's people? God brings judgment upon it, and He protects His people. And that's exactly what we see in Egypt. They were oppressing them as slaves. God brought His people out of oppression, judged that nation, and brought His people and gave them their own land. And really that's how God will work a lot of the times, is He will bring vengeance upon those who are evildoers. But He uses the government as an avenger to keep laws and to enforce. He has a good intention with it, even though it doesn't always work out that way. And look in verse 6, it says, "For because of this you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing." So we see it here in Egypt, and it says this is what it's like in Egypt, even to this day. So whoever was writing the book of Genesis, whenever that was happening, it says even to this day, this is the ordinance in Egypt: 1/5 of all the produce goes to the Pharaoh. And so you see it's established, and that's what they are busy doing. When our government takes our taxes, that's what governments are doing, and that's what God said. That's their business. So don't resist it. Go along with it and pay your taxes. And Jesus, when they said, "Should we pay taxes to Caesar?" He's like, "Well, show me a coin." "All right, whose face do you see on the coin?" "Caesar's." "All right, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. If it has Caesar's image on it, it belongs to him. And render to God the things that are God. If it has God's image on it, it belongs to Him." And really you see that concept. Jesus did the same thing. He said that's what God placed in there. When you talk to Pilate, you'd have no authority unless God gave it to you. And I find this is just kind of an interesting text where you can kind of see the behind the scenes. Well, how does this come to be? Well, God works it out, and this is one of the ways you see God working providentially to establish a governmental system to rule over people and to manage His creation. But by the same efforts, God will protect us as well. And so even if there is persecution, we're expected to be faithful, and He will shelter His people. We need to trust in Him to do that. And that's something we need to also trust in Him and to do what is right, regardless of what God has, whatever's going on in the government. We need to be faithful to God. And really, there's two options, right? There is the option you go along with the government and you comply if you can, but when complying with the government violates the command of God, then you violate the command of God and pay whatever penalty comes along with that. And that's our choices, is we can either comply or comply with God and take whatever penalty. That's what Jesus did, right? Is He complied with the will of God, which meant He had to go to execution unjustly. And He went. So same thing, is if the government is telling us to go against what God commanded us to do, and we say we can't do that, then if there's a fine, we pay the fine. If there's a cost, we pay the cost. And we just bear up under it because that's what God asks us to do. So anyway, I just find this just kind of an interesting little little chunk that you see kind of behind the scenes of how God works. In chapter 48, here we see an interesting element to the sons of Israel in that Jacob adopts Joseph's sons. So in this chapter, it says, now it came about, 48 verse 1, now it came about after these things that Joseph was told, behold, your father is sick. So he took his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, with him. When it was told to Jacob, behold, Joseph has come to you, Israel collected up his strength and sat up in the bed. Then Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. And he said to me, behold, I will make you fruitful and numerous, and I will make you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your descendants for your possession and everlasting possession. Now your 2 sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. But your offspring that have been born after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the names of their brothers in their inheritance. Now as for me, when I came to Paddan, Rachel died. So we'll stop right there. So here Jacob says, your 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, I'm adopting them. They're my sons. So the reason why he did that is because he gave the double portion of the firstborn to Joseph. And the way he did that is by adopting Joseph's 2 sons and leaving an inheritance to them. So when we read about the children of Israel, Ephraim and Manasseh are included in that list. They're included in that list because Jacob said, just as Reuben and Simeon, my first 2 children, belong to me, so Ephraim and Manasseh, they belong to me. The rest of your children will be under their name, but these ones are my sons. And that's an interesting thing. I never quite picked up on that concept that he adopted them and made them, but that's so he could give Joseph a double portion. The reason why he gave Joseph a double portion, which we'll get into here in a minute, but is because Reuben gave it up. And so he passed on the patriarch, the chieftain blessing to Judah, and he gave the double portion to Joseph, which is interesting to me that it's not the firstborn that got it, it's the second firstborn that got it. And you kind of see a parallel there between Adam and Jesus, in that Jesus is the one who got the double portion and the blessing, even though Adam was God's firstborn son in the sense of creation. So you kind of see a parallel there. But you also see, because of Reuben's sin, it was removed from him and given to someone else. So he adopts Ephraim and Manasseh as his own sons. And the other thing he does with Ephraim and Manasseh is he gives preeminence to the younger. And so as the picture shows, you have the 2 boys. They're probably closer to 20, so this maybe looks a little young. But Joseph sets it where his right hand's on the oldest, his left hand's on the youngest, and Jacob crisscrosses. And Joseph says, you got it wrong. And he's like, and Jacob says, no, I don't. He's like, I'm doing it. I know what I'm doing. So he gives the preeminence to, now I get it mixed up. Manasseh, I think, was the oldest, and Ephraim was the second. And he gives a preeminence to Ephraim in blessing him above his brother. Let me just look this over real quick. Yeah, so he gives a preeminence to Ephraim. Manasseh means God has given me peace and has made me forget my troubles and my affliction and my father's house. And Ephraim means God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. So he takes those 2 sons who are both blessings. He adopts them, and they are the preeminent son. They get the double portion in Israel's blessings because of that. Because Joseph was the faithful son, and so he gives that blessing to Joseph. In verse 15, verse 15 is a fascinating verse. This is kind of a statement of Jacob's faith. And if you were a shepherd, this would probably mean a little bit more to you. Verse 15, he blessed Joseph and said, The God before whom my father Abraham and Isaac walk, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads. Notice what he says. God has been my shepherd. Now, most of the time when people talk about sheep, do they talk about them as wise, intelligent, shrewd animals? Or do they talk about them as if they didn't have someone showing them what to do, there would be no more sheep? Right? In fact, from something that kind of struck me in the evidences class we did is sheep have never been without a shepherd. Abel was a keeper of sheep, and from the very beginning of history, from the very first guy on down the list, sheep have been kept because they really aren't survivors, so to speak. Jacob was a shepherd. I'm sure he could have told you a lot of stories. Just like I used to have chickens, and I can tell you all the ways that chickens are dumb. Jacob was a shepherd, and I'm sure he could tell you all the ways sheep are clueless, they get lost, they need someone to show them where to eat, where to drink, not to run away or wander off. They need to be searched out and found. All those things that come along with being a shepherd. And you know what Jacob says about himself? God's been my shepherd. I have been dumb my whole life, but He has been with me, He has guided me, He has provided for me, He has looked after my well-being. When Jacob was traveling back down to his homeland, his brother Esau wanted to rush them, and he's like, no, we're going to move at the pace of the children and the animals because I care about them. He wasn't in a rush to get where he was going. He was making sure he was preserving his beasts, and that's what a shepherd does. And Jacob, at the end of his life, says, God has been my shepherd. And then, verse 16, the angel who's redeemed me from evil. This is talking about the angel of the Lord, the one who was with him, who made promises to him. And the interesting thing about this is he says he redeemed me. What did Jacob do in his life? If you think about it, he ended up fleeing his family home because his brother wanted to murder him. He gets up to Laban. He gets worked over by Laban a little bit. And then he ends up taking all Laban's flock, and as he's running away, here's Laban coming after him to kill him. So now here's Jacob in the middle. He's got one set of problems coming from the north, one set of problems coming from the south. Here he is in the middle, and who delivered him from all of that? God. And then he goes to Shechem. His sons go and murder a town, and all the other surrounding nations would want justice, and Jacob was afraid, and when he began leaving, God put a fear in all those people and protected him as he was able to escape to, there's some tower, the tower of something. Jim?
His blessings flowed immediately to his two sons?
I don't know on that, actually. I hadn't thought about that question, but I know that Joseph is blessed later on, so I think this is maybe dealing with giving away the birthright blessing here, or the double portion blessing of the birthright, but I'm not sure beyond that. So the angel redeemed him from all evil, and one thing I can, just in my own life, there are so many times where I did not get what I deserved. Where I made mistakes that should have had consequences like this, and they were consequences like this. And we could say the same thing. The Lord is my shepherd, and He's redeemed me from all evil. And ultimately, what Jesus did for us is He paid. He is our Redeemer. He will redeem us from all our evil if we are faithful. And that's what Jacob recognized in God. Through his rough life, that was short and miserable and tough, and yet from where he sits now, he was delivered from Laban, he was delivered from Esau, he was delivered from vengeance in Shechem, he was delivered from a famine, he was delivered from his sons who lied to him about killing Joseph when Joseph was alive, and now he comes up and he's like, I didn't even expect to see your face, but now I'm looking at the face of your sons. What a blessing that is. And here at the end of his life, he even knows he's going to be delivered back to the land which God promised him. And he has absolute confidence God's going to keep that promise, even if he dies before that promise comes true. And you really see just the journey of faith that Jacob had. And, you know, some people go down a path like Jacob, and they die with faith. But some people go down a path like Abraham, where they have some troubles along the way. But Abraham lived a faithful life his whole life, and he was blessed at the end of his life. He was a ripe old age, full of years, and they were good years. And so we need to make a choice. It doesn't mean we don't end with faith. But there's a better way. And the sooner you choose a better way, I'm talking to the children in the room, the sooner you choose the better way, the better off you're going to be. You don't have to live Jacob's life. You can live Abraham's life. You can live Joseph's life. You can have faith in God and be delivered and protected and see the blessings of God throughout your life. And not just you, but everyone around you seeing it if you choose Him at a young age. And that's something you can do, and you're blessed to be in a place where you have so many people willing to help you and lead you into that. And so the earlier we choose that, but that's good for everyone. That would be good for, I was picking on Roger being the oldest guy here. I don't know if he is or isn't, but that would be good, just as good for Roger to take as it is for Curtin over here, who just turned 9 years old last week. So you see this example of Jacob is a good example. We can learn from it no matter where you fall in the spectrum of life. Any thoughts or comments on that before we move forward? In verse 16, and this is the last thing I'll say about this, the end of verse 16, it says, "Bless the lads, and may my name live on them, and the names of my father Abraham and Isaac, and may they grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." I find I appreciate this verse. Because if you think about what he's saying, Abraham was faithful, Isaac was faithful, I am faithful, Joseph is faithful, and may you be faithful. That's 5 generations of faith. May the names of your fathers be on them. And that's what we want for our children, is pray, may my father's name. Now, our father, we don't get to go, may not go back 5 generations, but we do go back to God, which is maybe 500 generations, I don't know. But that's whose name we want imprinted on them. That's whose will we want them to represent, is a faith that God has given them. And Jacob here he is adopting 2 boys and saying they're part of my house and they are going to inherit God's promise. What has God done for us? We may not have been born into His house, but He adopted us and says, you're the ones who are going to receive the double portion. And you're going to inherit with my sons. And that's what it says in Ephesians. I think it's Ephesians 2. I'm winging it on this one a little bit. Ephesians 2:1, "And you were dead in your trespasses and sin, in which you formerly walked according to the..." Let me see. Verse 4, Ephesians 2:4, "But God, being rich in mercy, because of His great love with which He loved us, even when we were dead in our transgressions, made us alive together with Christ, for by grace you have been saved, and raised us up with Him, and seated us with Him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, so that in the ages to come He might show us the surpassing riches of His grace and in kindness toward us in Jesus Christ. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourself, it is the gift of God. Not as a result of works that no one may boast, for we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand so that we would walk in them." Here it says that while we were dead in our trespasses and sin, He raised us up with Christ. He seated us with Him, caused us to rule with Him, caused us to inherit with Him, and just goes down the list of this is what God has done for us. It's the same thing that Jacob is doing here for these 2 boys. It's just a foreshadowing of Christ. Is God saying, you're no longer Joseph, Jacob saying, you're not Joseph's sons, you're my sons, and you will inherit with all my sons. You will get an equal portion with them. And that is quite a blessing Jacob is bestowing onto these children. But it's a symbol. That's what Christ is going to do for us. And also, the younger is going to receive the greater blessing than the older. And that's also a foreshadowing, because the church of Israel was small compared to the church of the Gentiles. The younger church is much more blessed than the older church, because the church of Israel became part of the house of the church of Christ, right? It's the church of the Gentiles, the church of the world. And it's much more, many more people from the Gentiles saved than from Israel. And so the younger has been blessed more than the older, and yet the blessing is for all, everyone. And so you see another shadow of Christ in that as well. In verse 21, it says, "And Israel said to Joseph, Behold, I am about to die, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. I give you one portion more than your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and bow." So here Jacob is saying, it's just straight up, I'm giving you a double portion. But then he gives this prophetic statement. He's like, which I've taken from the Amorite with my sword and bow. How is this double portion, when is this double portion going to be delivered to Joseph's sons? After war. Jacob has not gone to war, but he's talking about the future. And he's saying, once you have gone back and the judgment of the Amorite is complete, and you seize the land from their hand because it's given to you by God, then they will receive their double portion. And I find that kind of an interesting thing as well. And as we move on, you'll see that he's talking about the days to come. Verse 49, "Then Jacob summoned his sons and said, Assemble yourselves, that I may tell you what will befall you in the days to come." So Joseph was acting as a prophet, or Jacob was acting as a prophet in this, and he was talking about the future. So now we're going to look in verse 49, where Jacob blesses his sons, and he gives them according to who they are. It's kind of an interesting element here. But this is where the book of Genesis starts tying together. A lot of the things that seemed kind of untethered when they came up, here it makes a little bit more sense. And so a lot of this foreshadowing that's happening in the book, and we'll talk about that for a moment, it ties together now. Because you start saying, why did Jacob say these things about these guys? Why did it turn out this way? Look in verse 2. "Gather together and hear, O sons of Jacob, and listen to Israel your father. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the beginning of my strength. Preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Uncontrolled as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, you defiled it, and went up to my couch." Remember that story about Reuben? And he took Bilhah, I think, his father's concubine, for himself. That was an irreverent, disgusting thing to do. And Jacob curses him for it. Just an interesting parallel here. 1 Corinthians 5. There was a man in the church who had his father's wife, and the church was saying, we've accepted him anyway. And Paul says, get that sinner out of your midst, deliver him over to Satan until he changes his heart. We know that that's wrong because God shows us here in Scripture. 1 Corinthians 10 says, these things have happened as an example so you won't crave the evil things they craved. And that's one of the ways the Old Testament helps us. It shows us what is God's judgment on this subject. Jacob is talking as a prophet here. He's speaking the future by the mouth of God. And he says, because of this, your inheritance is removed. What did Reuben lose? He lost his preeminence and a double portion. Both things he gave up. Jacob gave the double portion to Joseph, and he gave the preeminence to Judah. And we'll see why here in a moment. Verse 5 and 6, Simeon and Levi are brothers, their swords are implements of violence. Let not my soul enter into their counsel, let not my glory be united with their assembly. Because in their anger they slew men, and in their self-will they lamed the oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will disperse them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. So Levi and Simeon, they were the ones, after their sister was mistreated, they convinced the men of Shechem to all be circumcised, and when they were in pain, they went and slaughtered every man in that city and took the plunder. But one of the things this reveals, they weren't interested in the plunder. They were interested in vengeance. And one of the things they did out of spitefulness, instead of stealing their animals, they lamed their animals. They cut the tendons on their oxen. So you see, it was more about the spite and their vengeance than it was about trying to enrich themselves. You just kind of see that in here. And so he's like, you guys will be scattered. And this is partially true. What happened with Simeon is they were the smallest tribe as they were going into the land when the Israelites marched. There was 20,000 of them. So instead of being given a lot of land, they were given a few cities inside of the territory of Judah, and eventually they were basically assimilated into Judah, and a few groups of them traveled outside the promised land to get a little extra space. But Simeon was pretty much dispersed absorbed by Judah. Levi never got an inheritance either. They were given select cities through the land, but Levi, their curse was turned into a blessing because of Moses, and possibly in part, we read about Phinehas on Bruce taught on Phinehas on Sunday, Numbers 25. Phinehas became enraged, but with God's zeal. And it's kind of an interesting parallel. Levi became enraged for vengeance that he took for himself. Phinehas changed. And I think there's an interesting lesson we can learn from that. If you have a disposition and you use it for the flesh, it's cursed. But if you change that disposition and use it in service of God, then it becomes a blessing. And that's what you see with Levi, is that disposition of furious wrath for personal vengeance was cursed. But when that wrath was used for God, then it became blessed. And a couple of times Levi acted in that way. When they built the altar, then the tribe of Levi stood with Moses, and then Phinehas was the family of the high priest because of his wrath for God. His zeal was God's zeal. Did you have a thought, Julie?
Interesting that of all the brothers that Joseph could choose to keep in jail, well, his other brothers went back, it was Simeon.
Yeah, and Simeon was the one who's rooting to get him killed.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Judah spared Joseph by selling him, but Simeon was bloodlust. And, yeah, he ends up being dispersed. Yeah, that's an interesting observation as well. So, in verse 8, Judah, your brothers shall all praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down to you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, they have gone up. He couches, he lies down as a lion. And so here you see Judah is a lion. And verse 10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between the feet until Shiloh comes. And on him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Then he ties his foal to the vine, his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He washes his garments in wine and his robes in the blood of the grapes. So you see the blessing on Judah. In Revelation 5:5, you see this scene in heaven where there is God on this sea of glass on his throne holding up a sealed contract that no one is worthy to open. And then John starts to weep, and the elder says, "Don't weep. Behold, the Lion of Judah, who's standing as a lamb that was slain." So the Lion of Judah is Jesus. And so you see the preeminence that should have gone to Reuben and didn't go to his other two brothers for their wrath, went to Judah because he was the next in line for it. His family is the family of the seed, the family of the promise, the one to look at to see the king come forth. And it's the family of kings until rest comes, until Shiloh comes is what it says. But until God gives rest, until the one to whom it belongs comes. And we see in Revelation, Jesus is identified as the one whom it belongs. In Revelation 12, verse 5, it talks about this woman giving birth to a son, And this son is going to rule with a rod of iron and break the nations with it. That is the son who was born. And here again you see a reference back to this prophecy of Jacob about the coming Christ who's going to rule with a rod of iron in there. And then the last one I want to look at, Hebrews chapter 4. Mike said, don't go by that clock. I keep looking at that clock thinking, but I think we're still good. We're still good. I'm glad I remembered that before we were 20 minutes past. In Hebrews chapter, I'll just keep going. I'll just keep going. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 5. It says, and again in this passage, they shall not enter my rest. So here it just kind of gives us a little context. He's quoting a passage that says, they're not going to enter into my rest. If we go down to 8, for if Joshua had given them rest, he would not have spoken of another day after that. So there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works as God did from his. Therefore, let us be diligent to enter that rest so that no one will fall through the same example of disobedience. Here you just get this idea. It says, until the one to whom rest belongs comes, Judah will be the family to look at. And Jesus is the one to whom rest belongs. And it's not the ones who are sons of Abraham that Joshua gave rest to. That's not the promised rest. That was just a promise of rest. The true promise of rest comes through Jesus Christ. And we all need to look to Him and be careful we enter that rest by living faithfully. And that's really what this is all about. And this is one of my favorite invitation scriptures, verse 7. Today, if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts. Today is the day of salvation if you hear His voice. And really, that's the message, is if you hear His voice and listen to it, and you too can have the rest that was promised. But here, Jacob says, Judah is the family through which we will receive the true rest from God. Here, then, we won't go through all these in as much detail, but there's a few that's good to pay attention to. Zebulun, verse 13, it says, the shore of the ocean and sea trade. So he just says, although Zebulun was actually a landlocked nation, their wealth came from the ocean and sea trade. So that's where God says, that's where your is going to come from. Issachar says, will be content in their labor, forced in the servitude. So they were kind of on the path where raiders would come through. So Issachar didn't seek power. They didn't seek preeminence among the tribes. They were happy to work their land. Like that's what Issachar did. They were content in working their land, and every now and then people would come and invade and put them into servitude, but they were along the lines. 16, 17, it talks about Dan. It says they'll be judges to the people, but like a snake on the path. And this is kind of an interesting thing. On one hand, in Judges, that's the tribe of Samson. And Samson was a judge. He was actually a powerful judge for the people. But he was also kind of, he was wise. He was poetic, a little bit flowery in the way he spoke. You know, what is, I can't remember, out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. You know, he's got his poetic thing. It's basically, heap upon heaps with the jawbone of a donkey. I've killed 1,000 men or something. Well, the Hebrew word for heap and donkey's jaw is this very similar sounding. So he's like rhyming along the way. So you see, he was a little bit flowery in his speech, but he was a wise judge, even though they only show his negatives. But he was a wise judge, and he ruled for a while. So you have a line of judges coming out of Dan, but Dan is also the tribe that set up an idol very early on, set up its own priests and was a stumbling block for the nation. So you kind of see these two things coming out of Dan, and so they are a judge to their people and a snake on the path. Gad means to attack. It says, Gad, let me read 19 real quick. This is just kind of funny to me. little point. As for Gad, raiders shall raid him, but he will raid at their heels. You know what the word Gad means? Attack. So attack will be attacked by attackers, but he will attack back. Like that's basically the rhyme in Hebrew, is attack will be attacked by attackers, but he will attack back. So he was positioned on the east side of the Jordan, and they would be their constant border skirmishes because of that. 20, as for Asher, his food shall be rich, and he will yield royal dainties. That is my least favorite one. I would not want to be told I am going to yield royal dainties. Like, that just doesn't sound right to me. But it is a blessing. It means that they're going to produce fine quality things. 21 isn't much better. Naphtali is a doe let loose. He gives beautiful words. So Naphtali is a little bit poetic too, I guess, in what he goes about things. 22, Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. Its branches run over a wall. The archers bitterly attacked him and shot at him and harassed him, but his bow remained firm and his arms were agile. The hands of the mighty one of Jacob, for there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel, from the God of your father who helps you, and by the Almighty who blesses you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lie beneath, blessings of the breasts of the womb, blessings of your father have surprised the blessings of my ancestors, up to the utmost bound of everlasting hills. May they be on the head of Joseph, and on the crown of his head, and on the crown of the head of the one distinguished among his brothers. That's a good one, right? So all these other guys, this is going to happen. Here's your future. Here's your future. Joseph, you're going to be blessed. And Ephraim actually was a very blessed tribe. And they were blessed with leadership. I believe Ephraim was the line of kings of Israel. I think, if I recall, Jeroboam was from Ephraim. And this was actually a blessed tribe among the sons of Israel. They got a big allotment of land, and they were leaders among the tribes of Israel. Verse 27, Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he devours the prey. In the evening he divides the spoil. With Benjamin, two significant events. They're the ones that ravished the concubine of the Levite, and so the whole nation of Israel made war against them for their irreverence and sinfulness. And also, Benjamin is the tribe that Saul came from, who was a tyrant. He murdered an entire town of priests because one man helped David. So you see that he's a ravenous wolf in that. 28, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father said to them when he blessed them. He blessed them, everyone, with the blessing appropriate to him. Then he charged them, so then he asked them to bury him. So he blessed every one of them with a appropriate blessing, is what it says. So that's where we'll end for tonight. We didn't get quite as far as we wanted, but that's all right. 50 is a pretty short chapter, and then we can do our review. And also next week, what I might do is we'll do 50 quickly. We'll talk about parallels between Joseph and Jesus. I thought I'd get to that tonight, and then we'll talk about the overarching concept of the book of Genesis and what it shows us in the bigger picture. Any thoughts or comments before we close for tonight? If not, let's close in a word of prayer. Our most gracious God and Father,